Hello, everyone. I see a couple folks are starting to trickle in. I think we're going to give a couple minutes before we get started because I believe everyone was taking a little health break, 15 minutes between sessions. So I'll get started in just a couple minutes. Oh, wow. A lot of people just jumped in. Okay, wonderful. So for the second time, I think we're going to get started. I'll write a note in the chat. This presentation is obviously we're doing a large slide deck, but I know this can be kind of condensed on the screen. So recommend everyone just kind of expand it to full screen, which you can find on the top right corner in the three ellipse if you hover over the actual presentation itself. For folks that are following along, a lot of text. We try to make it engaging and stuff, and we hope everyone can kind of see the text as we ask a couple questions throughout the whole presentation. So with that, let's get started. This is Social Network Analysis Methods for Network Building and Impact. My name is Philip Davidovich, and I'm a Senior Technical Specialist at IREX focusing on data and digital development. And with me is Aisha Thompson.
Hi everyone, my name is Aisha. I'm a MEL advisor here at IREX. I'm so delighted to be here with Phil to present on this great topic.
So today we have a few things on the agenda. We're going to start by introducing social network analysis, the terminology. It's definitely, as we'll explore, a field full of different jargon and somewhat we will even acknowledge, and to a certain degree, competing or conflicting terminology. So understanding and getting everyone on the same page, what we mean by certain concepts and how we've applied them in other studies. Then we're going to dive into the application and the components that have made up certain tools and research methods that we've applied and where we see it moving forward and how it's complementary with other things. Fourth is going to be the values and limitations of conducting a social network analysis, as well as things to keep in mind if developing with mixed methods and then other approaches. And then finally, we're going to highlight the Fellowship Alumni Network Study, which is kind of bringing it up together, everything together, and acknowledging that this is a community of practice, especially in the fellowship space, where we're trying to support our alumni to build networks. And this is a study that IREX has been funded by the Kellogg Foundation to convene different organizations together, almost kind of like a call to action after this session to inform everyone where they can get more information and where they can use resources to inform their programming decision. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Aisha and can get started.
Hi everyone, so great that you're here today. So let's talk about social networks and social network theory. So as practitioners working with leadership fellowships, we have all learned, and I'm sure we know, that there is value in collaboration and networked leadership models, because we know, especially so in this last year, that we are capable of doing greater things together. And so looking at networks is really our social, put simply, social network theory is really the study of how people and organization and groups interact with each other inside their network, right? How are we collaborating together? So broadly, that is what that is. But we have different tools for studying networks. And for example, and some of the tools mentioned here are network analysis, which we will go into depth today and talk about the social network analysis. But there are also other tools that we can use when we're examining our networks, or looking at collaboration, or looking at these different things that we want to understand within our networks. And so social network analysis is just one of those tools. We also have, focus groups or key informant interviews. We can also examine our networks using social capital or social cohesion theory. So there are many different tools that we can use, but today we are focusing on social network analysis. Next slide. Yeah. And so, as I said earlier, we know that we're better together. We know that when we're collaborating, we can do more things together. We can move forward in a way that will help us to really see what is going on. But again, as practitioners, how do we know that we're succeeding at collaboration? How do we even know that we have created a healthy network How do we know where the gaps are that we need to close? And this is where social network analysis comes in. Social network analysis helps us to map and measure the relationship and the flows between people, groups, and organizations to improve communities. And I said, identify missing links and improve connection between the groups. That is what we'll be talking about in greater detail today. Phil?
So we kind of wanted to kick things off with starting with the jargon, essentially, the concepts and or terms that you might see floating around when people talk about social network analysis, and try and demystify and get everyone on the same page. So in the chat, if you can see again, making the presentation full screen, as we're describing each of these, try and see if you can identify what the shapes are in the figure on the right-hand side based on how each are defined. And the first one, I'll go through each one at a time. The nodes. A node is a person, organization, or even idea. A link is the connection between those two nodes. A cluster is cluster is a group of nodes that are more connected to each other than other nodes outside of them. A bond or a hub is a node at the center of a cluster, usually very central in how information might be spread between that unique cluster individually. A bridger, finally, is a node that connects different clusters together. So try and see if you can identify the lingo in that chart. Essentially, when we talk about nodes, we're talking about those red circles that are cluttered around the whole figure, right? When we think of links, we're talking about those lines between each of those red circles, the nodes. When we think of the clusters, we're talking about those yellow circles that are where basically groups of nodes are being connected to each other. And we think of bonds or hubs, we think of that green star on the top left corner that's central within one of those clusters, a central information share within a specific group. And when we think of a bridger, we think of that purple star in the very center of all these different clusters that are a link between so many different groups that can also be known as a bridger, or also termed as like a bottleneck as well. You can see those terms kind of interchangeably. So that's the type of lingo we wanted to start off with, just to get everyone on the same page of what we'll be talking about, and essentially the types of graphics that this type of analysis is digging into. We're talking about maps, and we're talking about how those connections are analyzed at a quantitative level. So here's the argument essentially of what's the importance of conducting a social network analysis in this way, this quantitative research method. And the reason for that is obviously IREX supports dynamic leadership development, and one critical component of that is establishing and supporting leaders in developing vibrant professional networks. So conducting a social network analysis can help fellowship programs, improve the ability to support participants in building those networks in the following ways. You can, at a high level, and probably most critically, you can inform program intervention opportunities. This is possible through identifying a community or of individuals or institutions that share information, identify silos or bottlenecks that exist in that network in need of more connections, identify less connected individuals and institutions visually kind of on the fringes of that network that seem like they only have one or two linkages to their own area. Secondarily, we could identify distribution of engagement of expertise, right? Where certain alumni may be sharing their information with most and less, and where is that distribution across the network, especially when it comes to information sharing and knowledge sharing. Where is that information being concentrated at, and what can we do to improve that diversity of the spread of information? And then finally, even at just a base level, we can inform indicators of network engagement changes over time. For fellowship programs, it's very important to understand how your program might be contributing or growing to a growing network of professionals, and what those ripple effects might look like. So at a very baseline level, they provide very meaningful metrics that you can just hold yourself accountable year after year. Julie, you have a question. I should probably know this, but wondering if the slides will be in the resource tab or somewhere else. We will upload the slides for reference after the presentation for sure. We'll share with the IFS team, and I believe they'll be able to share the whole deck, I believe, on Google Drives in the repository afterwards for sure. Thanks for asking. And when we talk again, when we're talking about social network analysis, the key word across this whole quantitative study is information sharing. Information, where that information is flowing between individuals, it could be institutions, and it could be groups of institutions too. So information sharing is really the center kind of theme of any kind of quantitative social network analysis. You understand why how that information is being shared from point A to point B, and where the kind of stop gaps are in those processes. So we're going to go through a kind of a high level, taking a step back, and discuss from a practical applications, how would someone go about conducting this kind of quantitative social network analysis? And for example, we're going to be using a research initiative we did with the Community Solutions Program, which is an activist exchange program that brings leaders from around the world to the United States for a 4-month fellowship. And it's been going on for 10 years, and they have a network of about over 500. I think actually at this time, there's 600, but when the study was going on, about 500. And we wanted to learn about what social network currently existed among Community Solutions alumni at that point, at the 7-year marker of the program. So this is a basically step guidance of at a high level of what the processes look like, and some examples of how a program like the Community Solutions Program was able to implement it or get it off the ground. Again, first step is defining that focus, that research question I just mentioned. What social network currently exists among community solution alumni? It's an emerging space, especially for a project that's been going on for 7 years. How have they engaged with each other already? There wasn't obviously a lot of opportunity when, at year 1 or year 2, but now that there's a sizable group that they try and engage with intentionally, what's the environment like? Just to understand some baseline awareness. Step 2 is decide what data you'll use to collect. In that case, we decided on self-identified connections from over 500 alumni in essentially a survey that people could identify who they're connected most with, and the relationships and information they share with between each alumni or each resource partner. Step number 3 is we collected data, and we launched the survey, and we monitored and followed up with folks, and we were able to get a really robust 89% of the total population of response rate from the survey. So it was really informative to conduct a rigorous type of analysis. Then finally, analyze your findings. We used tools Kumu and just basic Excel to visualize and analyze all the findings. So we really want to highlight that you don't need some robust programming experience to analyze the social network analysis survey. There's a lot of resources like Kumu out there that we'll share in a bit, and how those are able to visualize and then conduct the quick metrics that are very valuable for social network analysis. And then finally, validating for your findings. A key component of, and something that we'll revisit continuously in this presentation, is a quantitative social network analysis is just a snapshot. It's just a very brief base level understanding of what the network currently exists, and it demands some more contextual follow-up. And so in this case, to validate the findings, we followed up with a qualitative social network study, and that facilitated interviews and focus group discussions and shared back what we found about the network, because it's a kind of core element about that type of approach. You're dealing with such tunnel vision. It's really important to have some kind of mechanism to validate those findings. So now we're going to talk about network maps. These are kind of some examples of what we mean by some network maps. When you think of a social network analysis, it's these overwhelming, we had the very basic one with like nodes and brief connections, but now you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of different nodes and connections, and it can seem somewhat overwhelming. But when you start digging into a social network analysis, it's really about compartmentalizing each of these in different spaces, and how you can approach analyzing these with a couple very basic methods. So the first kind of method is the clusters, right? On the left-hand side, this was the example that we were talking about. With the alumni network survey, we got a very robust 493 responses, which represent 89% of the total total alumni, and then that constituted over 1,700 connections independently. So that's what produced this very overwhelming graph. But on the right, the first kind of mechanism you can do to really dissect and understand what that graph or that map represents is start clustering. And one approach is clustering by colors, right? And what we see on the right here is what we did was just a basic cluster by their cohort year when they engaged in the fellowship. And you can already start to see a couple of the different clusters that are forming. Obviously, the red and the blue look very kind of defined, which means they're clustered almost in silos and stuff. Those happen to be the more recent cohorts. So it was justifiable for them to not have connected with all the other alumni yet. But then you get the older alumni that have took the fellowship earlier on, and they're a bit more spread out and intermingled in this stuff. And that was a very interesting insight of seeing who was able to intermingle between and cross cohorts. So right off the bat, you get to see some interesting insights that can inform where you want to take the social network analysis moving forward. The next one, obviously, is sinking your teeth into degree. And I'm going to challenge everyone in the chat, as I go through each of these definitions, try and answer the question in blue. And so I'm going to go through each of the definitions, and I'll start back at the top and tell everyone what the answers are. So the first one is degree, and degree simply counts the total number of connections an element has. So the question we're going to ask folks to see if they can put in the chat is, what is the degree of node number 2? The second question, or the second one, is out degree.
Phil, I see some people are answering, so we want to give them an opportunity to answer. So I see Mindy, Meredith, and Julia. They all said 4. So, and Latina also says 4. So
wonderful. Yeah, and Julia, to your point, direct for degree, directionality does not matter. Either one, it's just the direct connection or the connection of that exists. So awesome. Out degree measures the number of outgoing connections for an element. So with that, what is the out degree value of node number 4?
Meredith, you're a star today.
There we go.
Everyone is a star.
Next, we have in degree. In degree measures the number of incoming connections for an element. So the question is, what is the in degree value of node number 2? Correct. Wonderful. Everyone's logging in 3. And then finally, density. And I think we'll flag this, that a lot of these metrics have some caveats to them as well. But density is defined as the ratio of observed connections to the possible connections within a network, right? So this might be a tricky one. But what is the density? And the metric is shared in percentage of the total example you see on the right. And for understanding, note that the total possible connections are 20. And Meredith is correct, 25%.
Meredith, you are the star today, and Latina as well. I wish I had some gold stars for you, but I don't, so I'll give you virtual ones or just thumbs up.
Well done, everyone. Again, this is just a few of the metrics and the basic metrics that you'll experience when you start to dissect and analyze any type of these quantitative social network maps, right? They're the most direct, and they'll always be relevant across any map, regardless of your response rate or any other of these caveats. But obviously, as we'll dive into when Aisha comes back to it in a little bit, there are some caveats to using and interpreting these results that have some awareness that you need to be aware of when you're actually trying to inform recommendations, particularly with density and comparing different metrics together. So we'll dive into that in a little bit. Next, we want to highlight that the network map. So these following ones, unlike a degree, which is
Phil, before we get into that, do you want to explain to them how the density was really kind of do the math? Because not everyone, I'm sure, apart from our super brilliant stars, Latina and Meredith, probably understood how they arrived at that 25%.
For sure. So for density, again, it's the ratio of observed connections over the possible connections. So we know that the possible connections that could exist are 20. And the reason we know that is because you can only have one connection to one other person, right? At least in this basic kind of graph. And so there's 5 different people out there, and each person can only have a maximum of 4 connections total across the whole network. So you multiply that by 5, and that's how you get 20. So where you get the real connections are the ones that actually exist. And for that, obviously, it's just the type of connection that exists. Doesn't matter which direction it's going. There are 5 total connections that exist on that map, which gives you the 25% awareness or 25% density. So this basically if this is obviously a very simple example, but then you get into more complex areas where you have analysis or maps that are huge with thousands of elements, right? Or even just hundreds of elements. And that can get a little bit confusing. And the density can just naturally go down because no one's going to know 1,000 people in the network, right? So when I was mentioning how there's concerns of misinterpreting the value of density and when you're comparing different networks together, that's obviously, you can have a really huge network and a fantastic density value could be even just like 10%. And that could be so robust and really meaningful, even though it's a lot a lot larger, but or a lot lower value, but a lot larger in the total number. So there's a lot, and then on top of that, there's other caveats to understand which metrics are meaningful with why what types of information you're using. So I think the bottom line is when you're evaluating these things, try to maintain or try not to compare them between different types of networks, right? Whether they're different fellowship programs, whether they're different, like there's no necessarily a benchmark where your density should be at a certain rate or even degree or in degree or anything like that. It's really relative to so many caveats unique to your program or your situation or institutions or anything like that. So I guess the cautionary tale is don't try and compare metrics between different networks and justify improvements on that. That's where a lot of misinterpretation on these things can happen. So with that, let's kind of dive into a couple other a little bit more complex metrics that you'll very likely see with future methods, but they're very future analysis, but they're very meaningful in the overall breakdown. And the big cautionary note again with these metrics is that they're actually, even objectively when they're produced, they're only meaningful if the entire network is connected to each other. So there's no isolated silos that we saw in that one graph earlier on where there was kind of disconnected silos from the main group. So that everyone has to be connected, and the total cluster needs to represent at least 60% of the population that you're drawing these conclusions for or drawing the kind of recommendations for. So 60% is kind of the threshold where you need to have at least some sort of like meaningful response rate to inform some sort of things for these metrics. And the metrics include closeness. And closeness inform basically elements with strong closeness can spread information easily. Betweenness, elements with high betweenness have more control over the flow of information and act as key bridges within the network, potentially between isolated clusters. And reach, which is two-length reach, which elements with high reach can spread information through close friend-to-friend network. I'm sorry, I forgot to include the definition specifically on why these are things, so I'm just going to anecdotally say it. Reach, the two-length reach is basically for every single individual node, what percentage of the total network they can connect with within two lengths of themselves, right? So one connection, and then it's basically friend of a friend mentality. What percentage of the network can this person reach with a friend of a friend? Betweenness is essentially analyzing that information flow. So how many, basically, and this might be a little jargony and stuff, but when social networks are, when you analyze how information flows from one person to another person, they can sum up all those different routes that exist within a network. And that betweenness score that any one individual person gets represents the percentage of those total paths that go through that person. Right. So when you think of betweenness, think about being a true kind of central information hub where information is going. So a really high betweenness score represents information, most of the information going through that network through that individual person. And then closeness, elements with strong closeness can spread information easily. So essentially, each of these metrics are at the individual level, not the overall overall network level. So closeness represents when people are very essentially, it's a calculation of seeing how close one person in particular is to the entire network. So it's essentially making a calculation on their general reach around the entire network versus the reach which is just limited to two lengths. So I'm sorry if that was a little bit convoluted and stuff. I felt like those were important concepts to flag. But what's really important is just what's bolded here. Closeness is easy to spread information very easily. Betweenness has more control over the flow of information because it goes through them. And then reach is spread information very rapidly. And now you might be asking yourself, what can you even do with those types of individual metrics and stuff when you have all these just people with like arbitrary numbers that you kind of see, like, oh, this person might have a very high in degree or not a very high closeness score or anything like that. What can you do with that? And the answer is you can really plot their distribution across the whole map. And so what you see here on the left-hand side is what we did with the Community Solutions Program. And we plotted all the individual closeness metrics in the whole map and stuff. And so what you see, the really low scores, that 2.5 area and stuff, that means people are very close together. But the people in the very end, where that circle is on the top right, that represents 3% of alumni who have an average connection path length of above 5. So that represents basically it takes them at least 5 connections to reach most people in the network, which is really high for that network compared to everyone else. So this is really informative because you can at least identify that cluster of people that probably could use some more engagement, or might, if they're interested, more engagement to connect with other people to improve either that score or at least engage with other people because they might be on that fringes area. On the right-hand side here, this is the distribution of that reach. Remember, this is the friend of a friend kind of concept. And with this one, the top 2% of alumni, the people in the top corner, we're looking for a really high number here because it's just a percentage. The top 2% can reach 20% or more of the network with 2 path lengths and could be valuable influencers. And when we think of influencers, consider something as simple as like just getting the word out that an application is open. These people might be people that you definitely want to make sure are on your email list if you're reaching out to them, just so they can spread that news more quickly. Even if it's an application for something else and a partner reaches out to you, they could be really great and valuable influencers when you're just trying to share information quickly and the deadline might be only 1 or 2 weeks away. So these tools can be really helpful just to inform and identify who the people are that are in these engagement areas and stuff, and how they might be able to support program activities and support the network sharing information. So what is important at this point to highlight, obviously we showed a lot of metrics and it gets very quantitative very quickly when you break it down, but what we really want to emphasize is what an SNA can do and what it can't. And the bottom line here is what I highlighted in orange at the bottom. What a SNA can do is it's a snapshot, and it provides the what, the who, and to a limited degree a how of a network and how it engages, right? And we say a limited degree because there's ways that you can understand how people are engaging in some sort of quantitative thing, whether it's bucketing types of engagement or even analyzing the engagement types in other ways. But it's really impossible to get the nuances of that engagement outside of that. So that's why we say to a limited degree of the how a network's engaging. But that's really informative. You can understand the scale, you can understand the silos, the potential influencers like those the 2 reach people that we were just mentioning, and more importantly, it informs future research questions, right? By understanding the what, who, and the how, you're really kind of only trying to frame that last but most important question of why. Why are people engaging? Why are people working towards or working with each other or collaborating in certain degrees? And that's what it cannot inform. And that highlights basically the individual characteristics of the elements, the motivations, the catalysts that got them engaged in the network, and then also the process of how their relationship formed and grew. And Aisha we'll talk about this in a little bit too. Every single one of those nodes represent their own network, right? Their own connections and relative engagement with different people. And people line up differently in their priority list, either with work or anything. So unpacking that is such a critical part of knowing what to do with that information and inform programming, that this quantitative SNA really just brushes the surface of and doesn't dig deep. So again, I think the big thing is that it highlights future potential research questions. And with this, I'm going to pass it over to Aisha to talk us through the values and limitations.
Thank you, Phil. And so Phil really did a great job in outlining what an SNA is, what are some of the metrics, what it can do, but really as practitioners, what is the value to you, right? What are some of the questions that SNA can help you to answer? And so on this slide right here, we see that an SNA can help you to answer who is connected to whom. In our fellowship, sometimes that is important to know because we want to know if people are collaborating. We want to know if there's, cohesion or cohesiveness. And so understanding who is connected to whom is important. We also want to know how well some of these existing relationships are working or how strong these connections are. Again, this is what an SNA can inform, how connected different sectors are within the network. And that is one of the reasons that we had hoped that in completing the registration and our SNA network, we'd be able to unpack some of these for you. And because we want to see where different sectors are connected, not as, and remember, in one of the first couple of slides when we defined what a node is not necessarily only a person. It can be an institution, an organization, and even an idea. So it will be using this SNA is would be really great to see not only how individuals are connected, but how networks are connected, and or maybe just where organizations even fall within these networks, right? Um, Again, do these connections have directionality? Phil spoke about that earlier on too. We want to see whether is it in degree or out degree, right? And so that is also something that we are able to see using this type of analysis. Lastly, who are the central players and maybe the outliers, right? Where do these, and this can help us to inform maybe where we need to build stronger relationships, or how power is shared within the network, or even who shares resources with whom and what kinds of resources. So, to you as practitioners, these are some of the questions. This is the value, understanding what it is and the value and the questions that it can help you to answer. Next slide, please. But of course, as with anything, as with when we conduct any kind of analysis in social science, there are some risks associated with this. And so one of the biggest risks associated with social network analyses is the lack of privacy, right? And so a network analysis starts with a survey, and compared to a traditional survey, for example, when each individual reports information about themselves, with the network survey, individuals are reporting information about others by name. And so, if we think about that, depending on the context, this could not only be potentially dangerous to others, but we are because the person in itself, they cannot control what is being said about them, and sometimes they won't even know if their names are being reported, and depending on the context of, or even the countries in which some of these people are operating, this could potentially be dangerous for them. There are ways that you can combat against doing against revealing names as well, but this is one of the potential risks that is involved in this. Again, with a traditional survey, responses are aggregated, but with the SNA, it reveals specific responses attributed to specific individuals. So we can see here where there may be some privacy concerns, right? And so that is one of the biggest risks when we're conducting a SNA. Phil, next slide, please. Another risk when we interpret or we look at an SNA is incomplete data, right? And Phil spoke about this earlier with the CSP, where they had an 89% response rate. The biggest thing with an SNA survey is that a network survey, it's more sensitive to data omissions than other kinds of survey, right? So because we want to have a full picture of the network, and so in order to do that, we need a robust response rate, right? And we need a response rate the recommended response rate is at least 75%, right? What is the potential that you can potential and I'm putting it out to you here. See if you're listening to me, because this is the professor in me. What do you think are some of the potential risks, or not risks, but as practitioners, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear, well, we, in order for this to be robust, in order for this to make sense, we need a 75% response rate? What is one of the first things that come to your mind? Okay, I see no takers, but one of the first things that come to my mind is that it is hard, right? It is hard to follow up. It is hard. Oh, sorry. Exactly, Hannah. We struggle to get to 50%. Julia said, first thing that comes to my mind is exactly. It is difficult to achieve. Mindy, the wording in the survey and how to get that response rate, that is important. And Latina said the lack of response. Exactly. It is hard work. It is hard work to get to 75%. It means a lot of effort on your part, a lot of following up, a lot of probing and pleading and finding those influencers in your network to get to that 75%. But that is one of the biggest risks when you do an SNA. It takes a lot of work because it is important to get to that 75. Let me not say 75%, but a large amount of responses, right, Phil?
Absolutely.
They said the sweet spot is 75%, but I know, great minds can differ. So but the important thing is to get a full picture of what the network looks like.
And just to, I guess, while we're on the topic too, and as folks were sharing some thoughts to Hannah's question about how we were able to succeed to get 89%, the big thing, and we have a more robust report about it, but being a very, very, very concise survey. All we did was ask them who their main connections are, how they might describe those connections. So it was truly a matrix of only about 4 columns that they had to kind of go through, and we limited their responses to about 10. So we made sure those were very concise, and we kept all other types of data collection to open questions. So the whole, if folks were able to just complete it, it only would take them about 5 minutes. That on top of being able to track and follow up with folks that were interested in completing it and making sure they had the opportunity, that demanded a very long period of time for data collection. So we did about 6 weeks at least of data collections with follow-ups every couple of weeks and reminders for folks to do it. The biggest risk on top of what, or barrier I might say, to a lot of this is when people when programs I feel like conduct SNAs, everyone has an idea that they want to ask alumni about, right? And so my cautionary advice is keep it very concise. You can do a lot more with a lot fewer questions than you can even think with, like, while we're at it, why don't we ask them a couple questions on this? Because that's really going to hamper down the response rate when folks need to respond. So we kept it to, I believe it was a total of 5 questions, including their name and, email address and stuff. We kept it very, very concise. Go ahead, Aisha.
No, I was just pointing you to Julia's question. She said, and then I wonder if the more deeply connected members might have a higher likelihood to respond, meaning it would skew the data. I'd love for you to answer that because I have a thought, but I would like for you to respond to it first.
Absolutely. And I think when you're interpreting data and interpreting social network data, it's important to understand where you're getting the data from, how it's being collected. So the caveat whenever we were analyzing that information was these were the 89, essentially 90% of the alumni that stay engaged with us, right? We felt engaged with them and stuff, but clearly that 10% it would skew the data if they were incorporated into that study, whether if they weren't connected to anyone or not. So when we were interpreting the data, providing recommendations, it's really important to frame any insight to the network that is existent of respondents, right? So you can't necessarily extrapolate and say it's the whole alumni network, because that's not really true. It's just it's a best guess of what the alumni network might look like, but at its core, it is really just this network of 89 respondents who did respond, and that engagement level can maintain its consistency. So agree that it definitely, like when you're interpreting data, it's really important to make sure that you're not extrapolating what it means, because as much as we do want this to indicate what the alumni network looks like, we're never going to have a 100% response rate. And so it's really important to make sure you do that right. And so I guess maybe, and not to go on too much of a tangent and stuff, but going back to that density question or density concept about how you shouldn't compare different networks to each other. The visuals that Aisha has here are a fantastic example of why that concept is really important, because the one on the left might look like it's a weaker connected network. But if you were to give it a consideration, like it's a institutions, right? Maybe news media outlets or other types of institutions that are sharing networks with each other, this can be a very vibrant network of institutions connected to each other, or community centers, right? So that could be a very good indicator and stuff. Whereas the one on the right looks very, very vibrant, but what if that's just social media data that's ambient already, and it's already going to be convoluted? That isn't very useful. So there are always these very kind of caveats to when you're analyzing a network, and not to lean too heavily on those individual metrics when you're comparing to.
Thanks, Phil. And Anna asked, if we don't have 75%, do you recommend we don't do a SNA? We asked for collaborations in our surveys, but have yet to hit 75%.
So I would still, so there's always insights for sure when you're digging into an SNA, especially. I think this a really important part to make sure you have in every SNA survey is some open-ended questions that you can ask them optionally, because those kind of open-ended responses can be really insightful. At the end of the day, what an SNA is intended for is to inform, like you mentioned, inform future research questions. So it should be kind of not a guiding star, but at least help inform maybe the next direction of a research initiative. So even if you do get, because we see this a lot, 30%, 40% response rate to certain things, understanding what that 30 or 40% of the alumni network might be able to tell you is really important. You can't extrapolate it to everyone, but you can really dig deep into what that network exists in. So even though you can't do 75% and do a lot of the metrics that we mentioned that might be a little more robust, you can get so much insights and the kind of static ones as a baseline, even if you're only dealing with 30 or 40%. So I wouldn't discourage folks to not do it if you think you can't get 75%, because I think that's a barrier that's going to exist across the fellowship industry. It's just a tough way of collecting data.
I will say, though, a cautionary tale in that not getting to that 75%, though, would be making general conclusions. And this is one of the things that is on this, a risk that is on this slide right here, is misinterpreting some of the results, or even drawing very broad conclusions about your network if you haven't really gotten responses from majority of the network. And that applies to anything, any kind of surveys that you do, but it's even more so with an SNA survey. And so that would be my caution in that. I think, Phil, if you could mute, it's echoing. I'm sorry, I don't like hearing myself. Forgive me. And I'm mindful that we only have a minute, so I will really go faster. I really had a cool exercise with these three maps, but if you could go back, one of the thing I wanted to really talk about here is also understanding or misinterpreting what we're seeing or how we're using this. Because if we look at these three maps right here, we might assume that they all have three different densities, as Phil said. But when we actually calculate it, they're all the same. And so we have to be careful how we use some of these things and don't misinterpret it, misinterpreting the results as well. We may see that John is an outlier, and we may make some assumptions about why John is an outlier, but we don't want to make these assumptions. What we want to do is use our analysis or the information that we have from this analysis to lead to greater questions, right? Why is John an outlier? Maybe it's because he's new, maybe it's because he's disengaged, or maybe it's because he's a bridger connecting people to other networks that are outside of the ones that we are seeing. And so very quickly, next slide, Phil. We know that the main aim is to understand your networks, and there are other ways and other in which we can understand and one of networks analysis outside of SNA. SNA is very quantitative, but we can also incorporate qualitative analysis. And so we have qualitative network analysis, which we can use. And I have this really cool circle here. A qualitative network analysis is really similar to the SNA, but it uses mostly qualitative methods or tools, right? And so One of them is, and the only one I'll touch on right here, is a concentric circles, in which we would place the participant at the center of this circle and then ask them to describe people who are organizations who they feel as if they're closest to, using the circle to represent those that are closest to them and those are on the periphery. And so this is useful in helping, not helping to get at why, or having participants name it in their own words, right? Who we feel is closer to us, but in a more in a way that will lead us to getting closer to why. The SNA, as Phil mentioned earlier, is good at telling us where we see these connections, but it doesn't tell us why. And so these qualitative methods are aimed at doing that. Another method is a mixed method, using, just as if we had mixed method evaluation, we can also use a mixed method social network analysis, which really is that sweet spot, right? Using both qualitative and quantitative. So the qualitative can be used to inform maybe what questions we put in the survey, right? Getting to that sweet spot of these 10 questions that would really help us to get these great response rates. So you can use a combination of the two. And the last thing I will touch on is that social capital or cohesion theory, which is really just understanding why people are, how people are connected. The jury is still out, they say, in whether social network analysis can help us to understand social capital theory. So one of the things that we can actually do is to use this theory to actually examine what we're seeing in our fellowships and what we're seeing in our networks. And if you could just give us 2 more minutes, Phil will speak about the fans.
Thank you, Aisha. And yeah, so kind of this last component, not to leave everyone hanging, I know we're a little over time, like Aisha said, is the FANS initiative, the Fellowship Alumni Network Study. So what this is essentially kind of a next step, or where we see this work going, because obviously a lot of fellowships value building networks with their programs and supporting their alumni and how they can do that in their leadership development. But there hasn't been a lot of robust research conducted, and at least consistently and shared commonly around how programs can do that. And so this project, FANS, which is funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which is also a sponsor of IFS, is intended to build that community of practice, or that collaboration and learning series. So what the FANS project is a collaborative research initiative that aims to learn about the positive social impact of fellowship program alumni that they have at all levels of society. And by doing so, this project hopes to inform continued learning in the fellowship community on how they can support alumni. So the big mission for this is being able to share common resources together and continue the conversation of how programs can support alumni, whether it's activities, whether it's evaluation approaches, or whether it's really just being able to leverage their network together, or a concept of network weaving. So not trying to grow it, but to connect it better between individual people. And so what are we doing? Why are we calling this like call to action at the end of this session? It's because we're seeking partners and collaborators in this whole research initiative. So organizations that implement impact fellowships and have existing and active alumni networks to participate in the research study, either as a outreach partner, so contributing to, maybe if you want to just join a learning circle or be a key inform interview or focus group discussions. But then also, if you want to be more engaged as a consortium partner, you can apply for those kind of positions or those kind of opportunities within that project, because it is funded. We finally have a little bit of money to give us some runway and how we can explore this space. And one of the big takeaways is we want to build a community of practice, and we want this to be a collaborative design process. So becoming a consortium partner entails being part of those discussions, understanding how we can improve these processes and design a research study that is most beneficial and useful for projects. So how can you participate? Reference the eligibility criteria and opportunities on the project website. You can get it by bit.ly.com or bit.ly/fansirex, which is right here in the link. And I'll make sure to, actually, I think you'll be able to click it directly. Oh, no, you can't do that. But essentially, bit.ly/fans IREX, and then also just join our Research Corner session tomorrow at 11 o'clock for more details, where the product director, Nina Duro, will share a lot more on how you can engage. So thanks so much for joining. Apologies for the mad rush at the end, but it was great talking to you all and appreciate your engagement.
It really was. I enjoyed our time with you all today. Thanks for being such great students. Bye. Thank you, Julia.